Before we get started this episode, I just want to tell you about our Black Friday offer. If you go to spectator.co.uk/Friday22, you can get 12 issues of The Spectator for just £12 and a free bottle of Johnnie Walker. That's spectator.co.uk/Friday22. Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on November 24th. I'm Cindy Yu, The Spectator's assistant editor. Coming up on the show, is China more involved in the war in Ukraine than it likes to admit? Owen Matthews writes about China's secret role in this week's cover article and joins the show, together with the security expert Emma Ashford. And has normal politics returned after months of turbulence? The government is now talking about housing, while Labour proposes laws reform. For once, we're not talking about some kind of Tory psychodrama. I'll be joined by Katy and James Forsyth. And a few years after Britain has left the EU, some are wondering whether Brexit is to blame for economic woes. I'm joined by Spectator Chairman Andrew Neil and Professor Robert Toombs to discuss whether Brexit Britain was really all it set out to be. And while we have Andrew, we also chat to him and Tanjil Rashid about the BBC's 100th birthday. Has Auntie lost her touch? Finally, Toby Young joins the show to tell us about his obsession with health, which he writes about in this week's issue. I'll be hearing all about his hypochondriac routine. First up, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, China has sat on the sidelines, unwilling to help the West in mediations while blaming NATO expansionism for making Russia invade. But is its position really so simple? In this week's cover article, Owen Matthews writes up the incredible revelation that Beijing and DC have, in fact, been using back channels to prevent the war from going nuclear. He joins me now, together with security expert Emma Ashford. Owen and Emma, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Owen, I'm fascinated by your cover piece this week. Tell us about your revelation that the Chinese were actually involved in the U-turn over the Polish MiGs and whether or not they were supplied to Ukraine earlier in the spring. Because publicly, that had been mooted as a thing, and then it never happened. And you're saying that the Chinese had something to do with that.
Well, yes. I mean, in a broader sense, the story is about China as sort of the giant sort of sleeping partner, the elephant in the room that no one talks about because they've actually kept their public diplomacy extremely low profile. But according to a source of mine who I've known for nearly 30 years, who works very closely with the Chinese government, there was a back channel intervention, what diplomats call track 2, through former European leaders who retired, who have had links with China, who approached the US administration and effectively communicated to Washington the displeasure of Beijing about further escalation in the Ukrainian invasion. And what did that mean in practice? I mean, it was a very fluid time. It was the beginning of March. And no one quite knew what the scale of NATO's intervention was going to be. And the Chinese basically drew a line in the sand, rather somewhat arbitrarily, over the 30-odd MiG-29s that the Polish Air Force were going to give to the Ukrainian Air Force. And Washington initially approved it, and then a day later U-turned and said, no, this is a step too far. And one of the major reasons for that was that Chinese message. And ever since, and the significance of it is that ever since NATO's military support to Ukraine, the material support's been huge. The military support has always been very limited. And the question is, why? Why are we, this is a question that the Ukrainians are asking, why don't you give us enough arms to really, kick Russia out? And the answer is that in part, I think there's a lot of nervousness in the West about the consequences of a catastrophic collapse of the Russian army and a revolutionary situation in Russia. But, as I reveal in this piece, another plank of that thinking is that Beijing has made it very clear that they will not help the Russian economy or military as long as NATO does not intervene with strategic weapons. That's the parameters of the deal that was basically, or the understanding that was made. It was not really a deal. It was the understanding that was struck back in March. And now we see with the G20, you have Xi Narendra Modi and Biden, basically all effectively condemning Putin and condemning the use of battlefield nuclear weapons. And that's actually an enormous shift for China, who started the year by signing, back in February, a eternal friendship between China and Russia. And now we have effectively Wang Yi, the foreign minister, doing intense shuttle diplomacy between NATO, between Washington. He met Scholz last week, and basically not meeting or not really dealing with the Russians. So clearly China's been on a strategic journey between February and now, particularly over the use of nuclear weapons.
Right, so has that been a red line for China throughout, and is that why they didn't want the war to be escalated through the supply of Polish MiGs? I think
it's more or less the only thing that they really care about, is to keep the nuclear dimension out of Ukraine. And there's a clear strategic reason for them to do that, because they want to keep the nuclear dimension out of the potential conflict with Taiwan.
Absolutely. Now, Emma, are you surprised that these back channels exist? Because the rhetoric publicly between the US and China, the West and China, Russia and the West has been so aggressive and belligerent that, it is interesting to know that these back channels are kind of negotiating almost as if it's a proxy war in the Ukraine.
Honestly, this is actually extremely encouraging reporting in a certain way, because it suggests, not only that, many of us had assumed for a long time that China was basically doing what it was doing out of pure self-interest, that it was focused very much on the potential threat of US sanctions. And this suggests, I think, more strategic thinking from the leadership in Beijing, that they are, they're trying to keep a lid on this, trying to keep a lid on the nuclear dimension, but also trying to stop this escalating into a broader Russia-NATO conflict, that they seem to see that they have a strategic interest in that. And these back channel communications, again, they're quite encouraging. We see that Beijing seems to be willing to talk to Washington privately. Washington, even as the Biden administration is pursuing this extremely confrontational rhetoric in public in the national security strategy, are willing to talk to China privately. And this is very pragmatic, realpolitik diplomacy. And I think, this is something we should honestly kind of be welcoming rather than being skeptical of.
I mean, Owen, this is, been my reading of the situation so far, that the Chinese are very pragmatic, very self-interested, and a lot of people in the West thought that the Chinese were on the Russian side because it wouldn't condemn Russia, or for its talk of national sovereignty. When the Ukrainian sovereignty was infringed, the Chinese said nothing. But at the same time, I think what we're seeing is that actually the Chinese are very self-interested. But it's not just the West that have got it wrong, is it? I mean, you reveal in your piece that the Russians also thought that the Chinese would come to help much more. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, Emma's completely right, and so are you, that actually the Chinese are, of course, extremely pragmatic. And there's a very sound reason for that, is that actually Russia has a fantasy of it being itself being a giant superpower and a major strategic partner of Beijing's. But actually, in economic terms, Russia is China's 11th largest trading partner. There are 10 countries which are more important than Russia economically to Beijing. And in fact, Russia is now does about $150 billion worth of business, up from last year by about 30 billion due to extra oil imports by China, versus at least 1.5 trillion business that China does with the West. So the Chinese businesses know which side their bread is buttered, which is the most important economic relationship. The problem was that China did nothing to discourage Russia's fantasy that China was their big strategic mate. And the wording of the limitless friendship deal of February the 4th of this year struck personally between Putin and Xi in Beijing just before the Winter Olympics, suggested that indeed this was like a major strategic partnership. And to answer your question, yes, I think that for the Kremlin, they believed that a non-publicized confidential annex to this, which the Russians have been asking for many years within the partnership or within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on, which was NATO-style Article 5 mutual security guarantees that had always been missing in the relationship. And then in February, they finally got it. However, it was qualified by the Chinese in a very clever way. So, for instance, the wording, I haven't actually seen the wording because I only have my source's word for this, but it's confidential. But the Security Pact was specifically excluded territories annexed by Russia in wartime. So that basically gets China off the hook on obliging China to defend Russia when it gets kicked out of Ukrainian territories that it's annexed. But indeed, that illusion, I think, was a contributing factor. I mean, I don't think it was the major tipping point, but I think Putin's mind was made up largely before that. But it was a big piece of the puzzle that they felt that with the Chinese security backing and with the Chinese assurances that they would defend Russia if it was directly attacked by NATO, that put them in a more secure and comfortable position to attack Ukraine. It was definitely a contributing factor.
Now, Emma, I mean, I don't want our audience to get too excited in thinking that the Chinese might come to, in the middle of this war and do what Macron wants them to do and end it early with some kind of negotiated peace, because I don't think the Chinese would really go beyond that narrow self-interest of preventing nuclear war. But can we see in this kind of back channels that they can be translated into wider areas of US-China relations, not just on Russia-Ukraine, but on other areas? Because frankly, we need these two superpowers to get along, at least not provoking war, in order for us to all live peacefully over the coming decades.
So, I mean, we already kind of talked about the good news here, and the good news is that clearly in situations where both sides have an important national interest or strategic interest, the US and China are willing to talk. The bad news is, though, that I really don't think that this is going to be translatable out to many other big questions. And that's perhaps or most likely because there are going to be situations in which the US and China are simply not going to be able to see eye to eye on these problems. I mean, the implicit deal that Owen outlined is actually a very good deal for us, and it's a pretty good deal for China too, right? No strategic weapons in exchange for no Chinese economic or military support in Ukraine. That works out for everybody. But most other issues, whether it's territory in East Asia, South China Sea, whether it's some of these trade wars that we've been having, there's not nearly as much common ground. And so I really don't see this necessarily getting translated out. Where I think, and again, this is sort of the interesting part for me here, is on the Russia angle, we see that the Russians not only, I think, misunderstood what they could expect from Beijing, but have also through this war placed themselves in a very poor position vis-a-vis negotiating with Beijing in the future. So they've sort of cut off their strategic options as well.
Emma and Owen, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV. A week after the autumn statement, it seems like normal politics may have returned. For once, instead of the Tory psychodrama, the government is occupied with policies to improve housing while negotiating with the unions. And Labour is proposing some policies of its own. I'm joined by the Spectator's political editor, James Forsyth, and deputy political editor, Katy. So, Katy and James, welcome to Spectator TV. James, it's been a week since the autumn statement, and no resignations this week. Has the Tory psychodrama kind of been put on pause for a bit?
So I think there were two immediate risks to the autumn statement. One was that the markets decided it was not enough, they wanted more specificity. That has not transpired. Sterling is doing very well against the dollar, and there's been no great spike in the gilt yields. They've gone up a bit, but there's no great cause of concern. And the second question was there going to be a big Tory revolt? People saying, "Oh my word, we can't be the party that puts up taxes. We'll vote down these measures." There have been some noises off, but that has not yet turned into a full-blown revolt. And I think the other interesting thing about it is I think budgets get in trouble when individual measures get split off from the rest of the package and kind of isolated, and then they become quite hard to defend. That hasn't happened. So Esther McVey, who I think has been the most vocal in opposition to the budget, she's kind of opposing the whole thing outright. She's not saying, no, I really dislike the fact that the 20p income tax threshold is being frozen. She's saying that she is unhappy with the whole package, which in some ways makes things easier, because rebellions are dangerous when people start all coming on board against one particular measure. So I think things have, by the standards of this year, and that's admittedly a low bar, things have calmed down a bit.
I mean, on average, there's been a resignation every four days or something like that.
There have been so many resignations this year that it is quite remarkable. And it's also remarkable that a week in which the Prime Minister announces who is going to investigate the Deputy Prime Minister over bullying allegations. That in normal times that would be a massive story that would dominate for days, but because of the sheer level of political volatility and drama this year, it just doesn't seem that dramatic.
And Katy, is there tension brewing on the backbenches about the planning reforms that the government wants to put through?
Yes, so we saw, or at least Rishi Sunak was faced with the prospect of his first Commons rebellion from his own side this week. And it was an amendment to Levelling Up Bill on planning, which would ultimately get rid of mandatory targets in terms of house building. And there's been lots of warnings, particularly from Rob Colville, who's a co-author of the 2019 manifesto, saying this would effectively be disastrous, and if you want to have younger voters move to the Tories, this would be the worst thing you could possibly do. Now, Theresa Villiers has been leading the rebellion, so it was her amendment and getting people to support it, and they reached around 50 before the government made the decision to delay the vote. And lots of people said, this shows Rishi Sunak can't get anything through. I think you've got to look at this probably if you take a step back, in the sense, I don't think this is about Rishi Sunak's leadership. Now, planning rebellions have happened under, every leader. If you look at Boris Johnson, after he won his majority of 80, he was saying, we're going to have the biggest planning reform revolution you've seen for decades, talking really tough. In the end, he had to back down on that quite substantially. He changed the Secretary of State in that department from Robert Jenrick, who was seen as someone who could not get the rebels on side, to Michael Gove. And therefore, he speak to the rebels, they're saying, well, actually, in a way, we're enjoying the fact that government's a bit more stable now because it means we can do things like this. We're back to debating legislation and trying to get calls heard that way. Of course, if the government is paralysed and can't have votes in the long term on these issues, on something which is such a key concern to lots of people, particularly younger people, that is a problem for the government. But I think over the next few weeks, you'll see Michael Gove trying to listen to their concerns, see if there is a landing zone, see if there's a way to pick off some of the rebels to a point where you can move this forward. Because on the other hand, you now have Simon Clarke, who former Levelling Up secretary, he's now saying, well, if you're going to have what he would call the NIMBYs, trying to stop growth and planning, he will have his own amendment to try and boost it, and this is about onshore wind, and therefore you're seeing different factions come together. So this bill is ultimately facing a headache for Michael Gove, but this isn't done yet.
And James, something else that set the cat among the pigeons over the weekend was this story about a Swiss-style negotiation, there's arrangements with the EU, and surely I'm going to be speaking to Andrew Neil about this and whether or not Brexit has paid off its dividends. Is the government trying to soften its Brexit relationship? What's going on there?
No, I think the government have been at great pains since the Sunday Times to try and put this story to bed. I mean, Rishi Sunak went out of his way at the CBI to say, no, this is not what we're doing. We're not looking for a relationship based on alignment. I think there is a question here though, which is, this Brexit deal in 2020, there is a natural, in the Boris Johnson deal, there is a review clause. Now, if you talk to some people, that I think there are people who think that you can improve on this deal in certain respects, like for example, recognising professional qualifications. Saying that German architects can come here and do that and work, their work would be valid, and vice versa. I don't think that would be particularly controversial, but I think if you're going to get there, you need better relations with the EU than currently there is. The idea that any Tory government is going to sign up to a rule-taking model, I think it would be a bad idea for an economy of the UK's size to basically be accepting EU rules with no say on them. But I also think it would be politically undoable for a Conservative government.
And Katy, over in Scotland, we've also heard about Nicola Sturgeon's ambitions to make Scotland independent. One more development in that story.
So we had the Supreme Court judgment this week, and it's effectively saying, no, Nicola Sturgeon cannot, through the Scottish Parliament, mandate a referendum on Scottish independence without Westminster's permission. And therefore it is, I think if the unionists were looking for a verdict they wanted, this would be it, because it means that they could not unilaterally have a referendum. But ultimately, and I think as the editor of the Spectator, Fraser Nelson, has written, it doesn't end here. I don't think it was ever the case that the case for the referendum was going to be purely decided in the courts, and it's about public opinion. So the imminent threat of one before the next election has been taken off the table. But you're already seeing Nicola Sturgeon saying, well, voters can make their feelings be known at the next general election, and you can see how there is still potential for it to backfire if it looks as though Westminster and the UK government is saying never can Scotland have a say on this. And therefore, does Rishi Sunak find himself in a situation where his government is under pressure to say when public opinion hits a certain mark, the government will review it? What is the line at the next election? I think that's one to watch. I think what's interesting and what the hope of some in government is that this ruling is going to see a breakout of infighting in the SNP over where this was such a wise decision to go through the courts when you now have this ruling. And the idea is if you can have the SNP fighting with each other, that means they have less time to fight with others.
Katy and James, thanks very much. Are politicians and the public having second thoughts about Brexit? Over the weekend, there were reports that the government is seeking a closer relationship with the EU, a so-called Swiss-style arrangement, while one poll claimed to show that there's now a majority for Remain in the country. Andrew Neil wrote that with the autumn statement last week, that was when Brexit died. And he joins me now, together with Cambridge's Professor Robert Toombs, who warns against the return of Project Fear. Andrew, Robert, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, Andrew, you wrote in your column for the Daily Mail on Saturday that last week was the week that Brexit died. Can you tell us about what you were talking about?
Well, what I meant by that was that the direction the government is now taking the country in, the economic direction, because of the war in Ukraine, the post-pandemic, the rather disastrous Truss interregnum. The direction of that is a high tax direction. It's a big state direction. It basically not going ahead with a lot of the free zones that Liz Truss was talking about. It seems to me to be taking the country in the direction not of anything like Singapore on Thames, which was a kind of useless shorthand anyway, but more like Britain on the Rhine. I mean, the ironic thing at the moment is that the more we're in the Brexit period, the more we're now becoming like a European social democratic or Christian democratic economy. And that as a result, the promise of a different way from Brexit, which is what the Brexiteers promised us, a different way of doing things. Well, so far anyway, it doesn't seem to be happening. And I think they are running out of time because these tax rises that have been announced and the size of the state that we are now heading towards, the biggest ever in modern British history, will not be easily reversed. And we could be lumbered with this big tax, big state combination for quite some time. And that wasn't, as far as I can remember anyway, the Brexiteer vision.
Well, Robert, I think it's fair to say that you're a Brexiteer. Was that the vision of Brexit Britain that you had, what we're living through at the moment?
Well, I wish I could disagree with Andrew, but I have to say I think that everything he said is absolutely right. It's true, I think, that, Brexiteers wanted different sorts of things, and some certainly wanted a sort of Singapore on Thames. Some wanted the opposite. Some wanted a more interventionist state, a levelling up agenda, a sort of one nation vision. I was much more in favour of the latter. I mean, Singapore on Thames never seemed very realistic. And indeed, Singapore, as Andrew implied, isn't like many people think it is. It's a very interventionist system. So yes, I thought it was an opportunity for us to get away from what looked like a rather failed and tired consensus about the way the economy in the country was run, towards one that would be much fairer, much more integrated, and much more independent. And although we didn't all agree on exactly what we wanted, I mean, the whole point of democracy is that's how you work out what you want. And yet it hasn't worked out like that, I agree, and partly for the reasons that Andrew has said, that the pandemic and so on. I think, too, because the Conservative Party has been fundamentally divided on this, that the forces against Brexit are much more powerful and much more determined than I think most of us suspected. I mean, I wrote rather optimistically that I thought in a few years you wouldn't ever be able to find anyone who'd voted Remain, because it would have become so obviously a sort of fait accompli. But as it is, I think the uncertainty about whether Brexit is really happening or not has just kept the division going. It's the uncertainty that has done that partly. And also the government's, I'm afraid, pretty lamentable failure to do almost anything of the things it promised have meant that people are inevitably blaming this on Brexit. And I've seen recent polling, well, not just polling figures, but a sort of graph of opinion on Brexit, which shows that it tends to go up and down with the perceived success of the government's economic policies. And so at the moment, it's very difficult to see how it could be anywhere other than down. And, there are some very influential voices that are determined to blame everything that happens on Brexit.
But Andrew, how much of this is down to politicians? Robert there suggests that it still Remainer forces at play, but I also don't hear much of a positive vision from Brexiteer politicians themselves.
I mean, I think there's no question that the Remainers have been re-motivated by this. The more realistic of them, which by that I mean the ones that are not on Twitter, the more realistic of them realise we're not going to join the European Union again anytime soon. That's not going to happen. So to some extent, the Brexiteers still have time to show to us, if they can, that it was a worthwhile decision to take. But the Remainers, I think, see that it's not worked out as the Brexiteers told us, and that there is an opportunity there. Hence, you see two things in the public discourse. Now it's time we told the truth about Brexit. It was a disastrous decision argument, and let's be honest about that. You see that voice being heard a lot, and then you hear talk sotto voce at the moment, but getting louder that, well, maybe we should rejoin the single market, or maybe we should rejoin the customs union. And I think the problem actually is, look, to one extent, the Brexiteers have been unlucky because everything was derailed by the pandemic and then derailed again by the war in Ukraine. And so I think that's pretty unarguable. On the other hand, it is quite clear they never had really a post-Brexit plan. Theresa May's government certainly didn't have any idea what to do about Brexit. In a sense, why should she? Because she was a Remainer. On the other hand, why would a Brexit party choose a Remainer to be the Prime Minister? Because a lot of the Brexiteers had formed a circular firing squad and shot each other. So that was their own problem. Boris Johnson's aim was simply to get it done, whatever it took, to tell the Northern Irish something that wasn't true. To settle for a border down the Irish Sea rather than between north and south of Ireland. He had what he called his oven-ready plan to get Brexit across the line. He had no real vision of what it would be. And I think also the British, how can I put this, the British political elite, particularly on the Conservative side, is just exhausted now. It's been in power for 12 years. The pandemic's exhausted it. The war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis is exhausting it. You don't really get the impression that they have the energy or the vision to get together and say, right, what are we going to do to make this a success? What do we have to change? How can we be different? How can we take advantage? Because, I think the one solace the Brexiteers can take, and I think it is a pretty miserable time for the Brexiteers, the one thing they can take is the European Union at the moment is going nowhere. The European Union economic model is not something that anybody really wants to copy at the moment. Europe is still in long-term economic decline. Germany, at the center of Europe, is now realizing that Mrs. Merkel's 16 years were a disaster for Germany, making Germany dependent on Russian gas, making Germany dependent on exports to China. So making yourself dependent on two totalitarian states. And at the same time, a green policy which has resulted in spending €1 trillion and still using lignite coal, the dirtiest in the world, to fire up your power stations. And I think when you add all that together, the center of Europe, the power that matters, is now in some trouble, and therefore Europe is now in some trouble. But can the British come up with an alternative way? The jury is still out on that.
I mean, Robert, before and after 2016, we've gone through so many years of argument, national debate about Brexit. But do you agree that it seems like the Brexiteers, once they had the opportunity, once this ability was given them, nobody really knew what to do with it? You yourself have just talked about two different visions, but even that second vision, the levelling up vision, Boris Johnson articulated it but didn't do anything about it.
Yes, I'm afraid that's true. What can I say? Yes, I think after the 2019 elections, there seemed to be, and indeed surely there was, a huge political opportunity to remake the whole of British politics. Lots of people said that. And what happened? What happened to the opportunity? Well, it was frittered. It was partly lost because of the pandemic, okay, as Andrew said, but it's also frittered away by a lack of determination, a lack of vision. And I guess part of the problem was, and I'm sorry to say this, but I think part of the problem was that there was too much assumption that the EU was going to give in, that they would be sensible. We signed a protocol, but after all, the protocol was supposed to be temporary. Surely the Europeans wouldn't insist on putting artificial barriers in the way of trade with Northern Ireland. Surely, things would be worked out all right. If only we were nice to them, they'd be nice back to us. And I think that was a rather naive reading of it. But, all that Andrew said about Europe is, I could not put it as well as that myself, as forcefully and as clearly as he did. And it makes me think that the argument in Britain is not really about the EU or Europe. It's essentially about who runs Britain. Now, am I too cynical? Andrew has his ear much closer to the ground, infinitely more than I have. But it seems to me that if you were to take a dispassionate view of the sort that he took, you'd have to say, well, look, the EU's in real trouble. It's not something that we can seriously suggest reattaching ourselves to. So we've got to make the best of a difficult situation. But instead, we do have people saying, now is our chance to get back into the single market or the customs union. And is this really a serious analysis of our economic and political situation and of that of the EU? Or is it just one side of what's become a very deep and bitter division saying we're going to win and we're going to rub your noses in it? I was on a platform with a very personable and rising star in the Labour Party who basically said, we've got to force the Brexiteers to recognise that Brexit's been a failure. And that seems to me to be a political strategy to destroy the Tory party and to get Labour back into power, which is a very reasonable ambition for a Labour politician. But it means that the whole debate has very little to do, it seems to me, with Europe, the world, and, what we might think of as long-term strategy.
Well, can I remain a devil's advocate here then? Because this is an argument that you're hearing quite a lot over the last few weeks that, yes, of course, Europe is struggling, especially economically. But when you look at the British economy, it's still going to be performing the worst out of all G7 countries, out of most OECD countries. Surely, if everyone is suffering and the EU is suffering less than we are, maybe we should go back in. Why is it that the UK has been suffering more? That's how the argument goes.
Well, I think it would be a big mistake to base policy on an OECD forecast. Because that's all it is. It's just a forecast. And the OECD is in the same league as the OBR when it comes to forecasts. It's invariably wrong. I think the OECD forecast will be wrong. I think the OBR forecast will be wrong. I think in a whole host of areas, we're kind of stuck thinking that high inflation's with us for a long time and low growth is with us for a long time. My own view is that actually inflation will plummet by the end of next year for the same reasons that were up in the first place. And will be and indeed, people have not noticed that the OBR forecast actually forecasts in 2025 deflation in Britain. Prices actually fall in Britain by then. Now, you can believe that or not, but it seems to me to be a mistake to base it on forecasts. Listen, I think there's a lot of nonsense around at the moment. The Remainers are playing the long game. They know that we're not going back in anytime soon, even though Brexit hasn't worked. But they think come the turn of the decade, if Brexit hasn't produced any visible dividends, then that will be the time Meanwhile, we're not going to have a Swiss-style arrangement. That story floated in the Sunday Times. Complete nonsense from beginning to end. For one very good reason, the European Union hates the Swiss relationship. It involves over 100 separate bilateral treaties, which the Swiss are trying to renegotiate. Some of them, the EU others. They've had no progress on anything. That's the last thing Europe wants is another Swiss arrangement. Nor is going back into the single market a credible policy at the moment, for the simple political reason that both the Conservatives and Labour want that red wall vote. And if you go back into the single market, there is no way you will be allowed in unless you give back free movement of people. And good luck with the red wall if you've given back free movement of people. So what I think you will see instead, if Labour gets in, and the polls tell us that is the most likely result, is that a Starmer government will try to get closer to Europe. It won't do a Swiss deal. It won't do a single market deal. It won't do a customs union. But it will not begin to make our regulations very different. It will not go down a different route in financial services. It will still try to keep us close to Europe, and it will bide its time. And if in 5 years' time a Labour government has been successful and Brexit isn't the toxic subject it is now, then you could see us beginning to move back in bit by bit. I think it's a much longer game. If the Tories get re-elected, because I don't think they've got time to do much before the election, they will need to come up with a number of ways on regulation, on research and development, on getting away from the prudential regulatory environment that the EU has to a more risk-based regulatory environment. If you take a combination of our universities, we have a distinguished professor from one of the best with us today. That London, Cambridge, Oxford triangle, there's nowhere like it in Europe. Nobody has that. The Americans have, the Europeans don't. If you add in R&D, our venture capital, a new regulatory system that encourages risk and innovation, then I could see a difference. But that will take another 5 years of Tory rule. I'm not sure that's on the cards, and I wouldn't expect to get it from a Starmer government.
Well, that's fascinating, Andrew. Robert, give us your take on what's going to happen in the next few years, because Rishi Sunak is a Brexiteer, but even if he was full-blooded kind of Jacob Rees-Mogg style Brexit, as Andrew says, he's only got 2 years left, and we may very well be heading into a Labour government. So what hope is there for a Brexiteer agenda at the moment?
I wish I could say there was more, but I think, almost anything which, to put it bluntly, creates a barrier towards our rejoining would be welcome. Signing trade agreements with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or as we have done with Japan and Australia and so on, those would be things that you would have to give up, or you might have to give up if you said you'd go back into the customs union. And also deregulation. I mean, Andrew mentioned deregulation of research, things like artificial intelligence and also things like gene editing. All those things are important and could be seen to be valuable. And surely they could be done in 2 years. But I'm afraid I'm getting to the rather despairing position of hoping that we shall be saved by the failures of the EU itself. For the reasons Andrew described so forcefully, the EU is in serious trouble, and the more trouble it gets into, the less attractive it will become as a future partner. And hopefully more people will realise that we have to make our way with Brexit and not try to reverse it, because we'd be moving from the frying pan into the fire. And things like inflation, the energy crises that are likely to happen in Europe if they haven't already. Inflation is higher in parts of the EU than it is in Britain. Perhaps these things will become clearer, despite the rather dense fog of propaganda that some people have been putting out in recent weeks.
Robert and Andrew, thank you so much. And Robert, we're going to let you go for now, but Andrew, do stay on the line, because I want to talk to you next about the BBC. The BBC turns 100 this year. In the arts leader of this week's magazine, Tanjil Rashid, a writer and sometime BBC freelancer, says that the broadcaster, once great, is now running out of steam. Tanjil joins me and Andrew now. So Tanjil, you've tuned in to a few of these commemorative programmes that the BBC has made to celebrate its 100th birthday. Having reviewed them for The Spectator and the Arts Lead this week, what is your overriding impression?
Well, as I mentioned in my piece, I happen to share a birthday with the BBC. I'm not 100 years old, but the 18th of October, I was born on the same day as the BBC. So and that's not the only reason I've got a degree of identification with the BBC. I grew up like most of us, sort of listening to and watching all of these programmes, and it really sort of shaped my life, my views, values, etc. So I've always taken a strong interest in the BBC, and watching and listening to these sort of commemorative centenary programmes. I was left with a feeling of that a sort of a great period had passed, and I'd maybe lived through the sort of the latter days of a golden age, perhaps. And a lot of these programs broadcast as part of the centenary are sort of archive based. Finding sort of incredible sort of clips with incredible people, incredible moments from the history of broadcasting, whether from the arts or reporting great moments in the history of not just Britain but the world. And I was struck by how brilliant it was, and that got me thinking about whether the stuff that's going out now, the stuff that I in fact have often been involved in producing since I work as a producer in television, would they fit the bill? Would they meet the mark? Would they sort of in 100 years' time deserve the same treatment? And the sad impression that I was left with was probably not. So as I say at the end of my piece, I got the impression that the BBC was this once great engine of culture, but it's been sort of gradually losing steam and perhaps even grounding to a halt.
Wow, yeah. Andrew, you've been involved with the BBC for a quarter of that century. Would you agree with Tanjil?
Well, I was born on the same year as the BBC was invented 100 years ago, so I share a birthday as well.
You're looking great.
I mean, I think the BBC is one of the great institutions of modern times. It's one of the things the rest of the world associates with Britain. If you look at what does the rest of the world like about Britain or admire about Britain, the royal family, English language, English literature, the BBC is there, our armed forces and the BBC. These are the kind of things that give Britain its reputation. And to that extent, it's been a huge asset. And it's done some wonderful things over the year, both in high culture and in popular culture. But its funding mechanism was invented in the same year that Lenin was rolling out his new economic plan in Moscow, that Bonar Law, another short-lived Conservative Prime Minister, was Prime Minister, though he did last a little bit longer than Liz Truss. And Warren Harding had become President of America and was just beginning to grapple with what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, which was the Watergate of his time. I mention that to show all these things, that a funding mechanism agreed then cannot really be the funding mechanism for 2022 onwards. And I think the risk for the BBC is that because the license fee is so comfortable, it's great to get 4 billion quid guaranteed income, that the mood will be, let's not change that, let's not mess with that. Whereas the truth is, in a world of incredible change in technology, and with the streaming giants changing the economics of broadcasting forever, making it more expensive, but also much more high quality. Ironically, even with £4 billion in the license fee, the BBC is short of money. It just can't compete. When I first started in the BBC, the cost of an hour of high quality primetime drama was about £300,000-400,000. Today, there is no change from £3 million for 1 hour. Netflix is spending £12 million on each episode of The Crown. Game of Thrones was over $12 million for each episode. And if the BBC is to compete in high-quality drama, it needs a better funding mechanism. It needs more money. It needs to change. Now, whether it will is another matter, because one of the problems Britain has always had is comfort. Let's just carry on, do what we're doing. We're great, aren't we? Why do we need to change? And I've said, you go that way, you go the way of Upper Clyde shipbuilders. In other words, you cease to exist in about 10 years' time. You need to change, and change in a way that will give you the money to compete in this new world of broadcasting.
And what about competition from other news broadcasters, Andrew? Because you founded Sky, you founded GB News, you've clearly always seen the need for insurgent broadcasters. Does that come from a place of thinking that they add something to the BBC, or that they can make the BBC redundant one day?
Well, one of the interesting things is when I launched Sky, way back now in 1989, which offered a choice that had been unavailable in Britain before, but had been available for a while in America, I thought the BBC would be the one to suffer most. But it wasn't, I think, because the BBC is quite good at reacting to competition, and also because the brand name is still so strong. I mean, I don't think GB News is going to cause anybody any problems. But ironically, in a world of a lot of choice, when you look at the EPG, your electronic program guide, when you see the initials BBC, they actually jump out now because, I know that channel, trust that channel, know where it's coming from. So in a way, a set of initials with a strong reputation are very important in a multi-channel world. But I think the problem is because it's funded by the license fee, which means everybody, whether they watch it or not, the BBC feels compelled to do lots of popular program that would be done by the market, whereas the original purpose of the license fee was really to do some programming that may not be done with the market. And I've suggested that the best way forward for the BBC to ensure its future for the next 100 years is really to divide it into two. To have a BBC core, as I would call it, which does all the stuff the market doesn't do. High quality drama, upmarket drama, serious culture, serious music, serious art, national events, national sporting events, all the things that we turn to the BBC for, political programming, news, of course. And that should be funded through what I would call an Arts Council of the Air. And I think it would cost about £1 billion to do all that. Everything else should go into BBC commercial, and it should stand or fall and whether the BBC can raise subscription money or not. After all, if it's such a great brand name doing such great programs, surely people will pay for it the way they pay for Netflix. I think that would ensure both a high quality BBC output and a BBC that would have the money to compete against the streaming giants. Will that happen? I'm not sure it will. And probably the license fee will be rolled over, and that will probably mean the BBC enters a period of long-term and inevitable decline.
Well, Tanjil, let's also talk about the content, because I learned from your piece, actually, that George Orwell's 1984 was inspired by the BBC from his time working there. I mean, that doesn't say great things about what he perceived to be the culture of censorship. I mean, what was he inspired by?
Oh, yes, Orwell was a great BBC figure. He delivered many BBC broadcasts, especially what used to be called talks. The BBC had a talks department. It's not something that exists anymore. And in fact, this was a great genre of broadcasts. Many great writers and poets and so on were involved in these things called talks. And it's a genre that's completely disappeared from the air. It doesn't exist anymore. But I mean, going back to Orwell, I mean, I think he perceived that the BBC wasn't just this impartial, completely neutral institution that was reporting on events in the world. It was very much bound up with the state, which is true. And of course, I do believe we have a pretty impartial and pretty neutral BBC News, and other broadcasts and so on. But Orwell sort of could see the danger potentially. I mean, obviously it's a fictionalization, but he was certainly inspired, even just physically inspired by Broadcasting House, and you can, if you read the descriptions of certain parts of 1984, you would recognise Broadcasting House. But yes, I mean, it's interesting what Andrew says about his vision for a BBC core and a more commercial BBC. I mean, I think this is quite a sort of an old-fashioned idea that I don't think would really be sustained in our culture, because we don't exist in a culture anymore where people are willing to accept that there are certain good things like eating spinach that are not pleasurable, that they don't really want to do, but they just should pay to be fed it regardless. We don't have that sort of hierarchical culture anymore. In the culture in which the BBC was founded, where you had the Reithian principles of to inform, educate and entertain. I mean, most people want to be entertained. Do they really want to be informed? To some extent, but maybe not to the extent that the founders of the BBC understood. And certainly this the idea of Hugh Weldon, a great BBC executive and producer, had this wonderful maxim that the BBC should make the good popular and the popular good, and this sort of improving, elevating idea of culture, I don't think has the public would have public assent really. I don't think we really sort of want to be bettered by people.
But hold on, there is still public support for the licence fee.
Yes, I think there is public support for the licence fee, but if you see what the BBC has been doing, in recent decades, it's progressively been moving to a more sort of essentially, there's very little to distinguish the BBC from other commercial broadcasters. They're not making the kinds of sort of highbrow programmes to the extent that they used to. I mean, this is clear from a lot of my impressions of the BBC have been shaped by my experience working there, and it's almost every programme I work on ceases to exist shortly after I leave, and I don't think that's got anything to do with me. It's simply that a lot of these very good quality programmes that I've worked for, there's just not the appetite for them. I mean, my first job at the BBC was for BBC Arena, a great, long-standing, extremely highbrow arts documentary series. That made programmes about great cultural figures, and I mean, I think they make maybe one film a year, and begrudgingly the BBC makes maybe one film a year just to say that the programme still exists, but it doesn't really. So I think the culture has moved on really. I don't think the values that shaped the foundation of the BBC, at least culturally, are still present to the extent that would justify the existence of the BBC.
I don't agree with that. I think the conditions are still there. We have the South Bank and we have the West End. The South Bank is supported by state subsidy and the West End is a commercial operation. But the West End would be poorer if it wasn't for the South Bank, because the South Bank has helped to create the skills that give us the West End, and a number of shows, when they're successful, are transferred to the West End. And how I would see it is the BBC core, which would be available to everybody, would be in some ways be the South Bank, and BBC subscription or BBC commercial would be the West End. And, as a consequence of having the BBC and also Channel 4 with all the number of smaller production companies that it has helped encourage over the years, this country is now a production superpower. By October of this year, there will be more Hollywood blockbusters made in Britain than in Hollywood. By September of this year, there will be more studio space in Greater London than there is in Greater Los Angeles. Around £12 billion of money will be spent on TV and motion picture production in this country this year. 12 billion, more than anywhere in the world outside of America. And that creates highly paid jobs, skills. It's not just in London. Belfast dines out on Game of Thrones and the Titanic now. And Manchester's become a big production hub. Glasgow's become a decent-sized production hub. This is what helps make us a soft power of importance, a soft power, something of a superpower. And of course, we have the huge advantage of the English language, and the name the BBC still matters all over the world. When I worked for the BBC and I was traveling abroad and I said the BBC, it opened doors. People had heard of the BBC. They knew about the BBC. And I don't think you want to give that away, but I don't think it can continue with the current. You say the support for the license fee. There's no support for increasing the license fee. Indeed, the license fee has effectively been frozen under this government in real terms for the past decade. And that means the BBC is running out of money. We need to find more ways, and it has to be commercial, of getting money into the BBC while protecting the core non-market programming that the BBC does. There would be more arenas in my ways of doing things. There would be more arts coverage. There would be more serious music on the BBC if you did it this way, but there would also be more money to make more high-quality drama that you can sell to the rest of the world. But I fear that there is almost no appetite on the left or the right for going down this road.
Andrew and Tanjil will have to leave it there. Thank you very much. And finally, Toby Young writes in this week's magazine about the pharmaceutical concoction he takes to stay healthy. But is it more faith than science? Toby joins me now. So Toby, let's start by going through your pharmaceutical routine. Tell me about it.
Yes, so I've for several years now, possibly decades, I've been going through the same routine to ward off colds and other infections. So I take a multivitamin tablet, I take some vitamin E, some vitamin D, I wash it all down with 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C.
In the form of what, orange juice or literally?
Blackcurrant flavoured kind of fizzy tablet.
Okay, wow.
Dissolved in water.
Yeah.
And then I've added psyllium husks, what's that stuff called for your bones?
Calcium?
No, begins with T. Anyway, I've been taking that as well, and a ginger shot. So it takes me about 10 minutes to get through this routine every day. And my wife and children ridicule me they think I've been kind of, duped by a snake oil salesman.
And it's for general health, isn't it? It's not for
Turmeric,
any particular...
that's what I'm trying to think of.
Right. Yeah. It's for general health.
It's for general health, yeah. It's not for anything in particular. It's just to ward off getting any kind of virus.
And sometimes you take it twice.
Yeah, sometimes I forget that I've taken it on a particular day. So my wife complains about the extraordinary expense. I mean, just 100 capsules of this kind of quite high-end vitamin E costs almost £20, and my wife is constantly chastising me for spending all this money on what is essentially snake oil, and I haven't had the heart to tell her that sometimes I actually take everything twice because I forget that I've taken it, and I'm going to have to invest one of these days in one of those kind of pill dispensers with kind of each day of the week demarcated in little compartments.
Well, Toby, those pill boxes, they bring to mind, pensioners or people, much older than yourself, if I may say so.
Well,
where does this come from, do you think? Because reading between the lines of your column as well, it doesn't really sound like you believe that it quite works either.
No, I think, I suppose one of the kind of oddities of this routine is that I do think of myself actually as almost superhumanly healthy. So the last time I had a day off work when I felt compelled to stay in bed because I felt so ill was in the summer of 1987. And since then, I don't think I've ever taken a day off work from sickness. And I work most weekends too. Even when I've had COVID twice, but that didn't stop me working. So why am I so obsessed with my health, given that I'm unbelievably healthy? And I think actually that is probably a hallmark of a hypochondriac. I mean, by definition, hypochondriacs are never ill, because if they were, they wouldn't be hypochondriacs. They'd be, realistically assessing their health. And to be a kind of world-class hypochondriac, I think you have to have not been ill for about 35 years. So I put myself in that elite group of kind of super neurotic kind of people about their health.
But so you don't know yourself then, from what I'm hearing. You don't know quite. I mean, it always sounds like an article of faith when you say ward off,
Well, I suppose it's a bit like Pascal's wager, even though, these things are probably useless, they might just be having an impact. And I sort of superstitiously fear that if I broke with my routine one day, then I'd suddenly come down with a really bad cold or something worse.
Well, are you tempting fate by writing about it and by coming to talk to me about it?
Maybe a little bit, yeah, maybe a little bit. I did say in the piece, I think, at the end, that by the time you read this, I may have been rushed to hospital with a heart attack.
Well, not yet.
Not yet.
And hopefully we won't give you anything here from the studio. I also just wanted to pick you up on this incredible insight into your upbringing, because I wasn't sure if you were joking or not about picking up chicken bones from the pavement and pasties from the bins.
I wasn't, I was maybe exaggerating a little bit.
Right.
But I think one of the reasons I am unusually healthy is because I have a very robust immune system. And the reason for that, I think, is because I had unbelievably negligent parents. So from the age of 5, I was really allowed to run wild on the streets of London. I mean, I would literally at the weekend leave the house at about 8 a.m. clutching a skateboard or something and wouldn't return till about 7 or 8 at night. And my parents, they weren't remotely concerned that I'd been run over or kidnapped or anything like that. They just assumed I'd be okay, and I was okay. But they weren't kind of big eaters themselves. They were both very frugal, not really interested in food. They were kind of, non-conformist, socialist, kind of hair shirt types. So didn't really have much interest in life's luxuries, such as food. And so I had to fend for myself. They didn't give me lunch money or, a pack of sandwiches to take to school when I embarked on a 2-mile walk, aged 5 to the local comprehensive or whatever. So I did have to kind of fend for myself in terms of, I would scrounge food from friends, but sometimes if I saw kind of, a half-eaten burger in a bin, I would take the burger out of the bin and finish it off. If I saw something on the floor, usually a half-eaten sweet or a kind of, a Fox's Glacier mint, half in its wrapper, half out, I'd pick it up and eat it, Didn't have much alternative. I wanted to stay alive. And it turned out that this kind of approach to parenting was actually, a real gift that they gave me, because, from the age of about 18, I think the number of days I felt so ill, I was immobilised. I could count on one hand.
Do you feel like you're letting your children down by not starving them?
I do sometimes think that I'm really, as a parent, I'm really hopeless and a bit of a deadbeat, because I actually do feed them 3 times a day and often take them to school.
What's that like? Toby Young, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. That's everything for this week. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next time.